Hello, coaches, and welcome to Give and Go Live. My name is David Newbury, and I'm joined by my colleague Ian Barker. How are you doing, Ian?
Very good, thank you, David. Pleasure to be here.
Good, excellent. So today's session is eye-passing pattern, and this is an activity involving 10 to 12 players. And as you can see on this first diagram here, we start off relatively simple with a player dribbling the ball out to a marker approximately 15 yards from the end line, making a tight turn, and then making the first pass back to the player in line. We will follow this sequence through, but that is phase one. So Ian, would you like to talk a little bit about some of the methods we might use here?
Sure. So although this seems very, very fundamental, a dribble out, a little turn, and a little pass, that really is the extent of it. Great opportunity for the coach here to add in some conditions. So I would start talking to the players about this being a speed dribble with lots of touches with the outside of the foot, close control, slowing down as we approach the cone, and then as soon as I feel comfortable, is asking the players at this cone to make a prescribed turn. So inside of the foot, outside of the foot, cut back through their body, cut back to the outside. If we could actually get it so that both players arrived at the turning cone at the same time, there's a modicum of pressure, a modicum of confusion. Of course, nobody's trying to steal the ball. So even though it's quite fundamental, the coach has a great opportunity to increase the degree of challenge and the increase of demand.
Thanks, Ian. Let's go to sequence number 2. But before we do, on face value, this activity looks very, very simple. And the question from Pedro wants to know if this is an activity you can do with just young players, novice players, or this is something for more an advanced player.
That's a good question. Thank you, Pedro. What we just showed you, I could be very comfortable doing with 6, 7-year-olds. Just a simple dribble, speed dribble, slow down, turn, pass. What you're going to see now, though, is how we've layered in patterns and more sophistication and more potential technical sophistication that you could be doing this with college-age players as a warm-up activity. So it's a question of you knowing your players and how complex to make the patterns. So the patterns can develop from extremely fundamental to much, much more complex.
So where we left off in the first sequence is a pass from player number 1 into the next player in line. As we follow through this sequence, the player number 1 has made a run to approximately 45-degree angle about 10 to 15 yards away from the receiving player. And they've then interchanged passes with number 2 playing the ball back into the feet of the player number 1, the original passer. They then combine with the receiving player moving to an angle on the other side of the cone for the passer to make a relatively flat pass back to them either on a 1 or 2 touch rhythm. Once that player has made the pass, player number 1 then makes a curved run, and the return pass is made in front of the player number 1 by the player number 2. So Ian, let's talk about how we might build this activity up with methods.
Sure. So just for the audience again, just to remember, we had the initial long pass from the first phase, second pass, third pass, fourth pass. So that's our sequence. It's a 4-pass sequence, but it's the same 2 people. Clearly, once the long pass is made, the movement here is at an angle. So we don't make a pass and follow our pass. We make a pass and then we move at an angle. That's very important. And not only do we have the angle made by player number 1, we have a corresponding angle made by player number 2 because they've checked out to the side. So we're starting to establish those triangles. Another interesting thing here that David has done a very good job of diagramming is after our first player has passed that ball, notice the shape of their run is out and wide as opposed to downfield. So if that player makes that run, that becomes quite a difficult pass to play. However, if he or she makes this curved run, that pass becomes a little bit easier to lay in front of the player. So I really like the idea of the shape of runs. And this again is starting to get some older players, maybe our 9s, 10s, 11s, where the shape of movement becomes critical to understand.
And something you and I were discussing before we went on air and has been brought up by Sally is what happens if the pass was made to the same side. So the first pass was made to the same side of the field as the passer.
If I understand the question, one of the challenges is if I make this pass and then I support here, I'm on the narrow side of the field. So the idea is that we play, and because we're in attacking mode, we move away from the action here, and you can see that we've made our field a lot wider and we've opened both sides of the park up.
Great. Thanks, Ian. So let's go now to the third sequence, and play has continued to progress. And if you remember, we had a passing combination between the passer and the receiver. The second player, the receiver, made a diagonal pass across the field onto a bent run by player number one. And to progress, player number one has now dribbled forward 5-6 yards and then driven a pass into the feet of the next player in line at the other end, who then sets off and starts the sequence all over again. Ian, let's talk about some of the methods here.
Yeah, thank you. So for the audience, so we've got this fifth pass. We've covered the first four, and that, of course, is the fifth pass. Some of the nice features now that I really like to emphasize is assuming that pass 4 was across the front of the player so they could run onto it. That's where you get our dribble run. So that's critical that that fourth pass is played in front of the player to receive and run onto. Now we can start to determine what type of service, because this is a fairly long pass, do we want to play in here. Right now, because we're going in a clockwise dimension, clockwise rotation, everything's pretty much falling onto the outside foot, being the left foot. So do we want the ball clipped in, chipped in, whatever? We could do the activity counterclockwise, and it becomes a little bit more right foot friendly. So you just got to be aware of that. But now, again, we have this notion of a 5-pass sequence, the dribbling component, and the quality, accuracy, weight of each pass, the technique employed becomes increasingly critical and something the coach can make a determination on.
And the last sequence, and the nuance here is we've now introduced 2 more balls. So here we have the original sequence with a pass out to the first player, the first passer. And now at the same time as that ball is played, and this is really critical, it has to be released at the same time as that ball is passed, the next player in line dribbles out the soccer ball to start a second sequence. And that's, of course, occurring at both ends. And so now we have 4 balls in play. Ian, your thoughts on that?
Sure. Just sort of a little bit of name dropping. One of the strongest technical developing soccer clubs in the world is Anderlecht in Belgium. And I have seen them do this type of activity where they begin, as David indicated, with sort of 2 soccer balls, pretty straightforward, but the pattern is complex. And then you introduce within the flow the third and fourth ball at the same time. And this is what they use with the players in professional clubs. Once they've got a pattern going, they don't try and find a completely new activity. They just layer in levels of complexity. And now the groups at each end are observing the other groups and making sure their timing patterns are synced up, because as soon as somebody gets out of sync, the activity breaks down. So you've got a lot of responsibility to be in the same pattern as your colleagues as you're working through this activity. So I really like this addition for a sophisticated group.
Thanks, Ian. Well, that's all we have time for this session. An activity that on face value looks very simple, one that we have now understood to being quite a complex and an excellent activity, even for senior players and high ability players. So thanks very much, Ian, for your time. And thank you, coaches, for joining us, and look forward to seeing you at the next Give and Go Live.